Korach is the name of an individual, a cousin of Moses, nonetheless, who leads a mutiny, a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. Right in the beginning of the chapter, gets up Korach and says, 250 people, he marches to and confronts Moses. Why have you taken this leadership? This is basically the first documentation, perhaps, of the rise against class distinctions. So long before Karl Marx, and long before Marxism and communism, Korach makes the statement, we're all chosen by God. Why did you take leadership? Why did you assume being leaders? And the chapter continues, a long chapter about how Moses falls on his face and grieves and is disturbed greatly by this challenge, which in itself teaches you much about volumes about a leader. Instead of fighting with them, he actually is very acquiescent. And ultimately it's proven that Moses was chosen by God, and so on. Now the Mishnah in Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers, it's a custom to study the ethics of the fathers. Some people studied between Passover and Shavuos. It's 6 weeks between 6 Shabbos between Passover and Shavuos, one corresponding to each chapter in the ethics of the fathers. And some continue studying it throughout the summer, all the way till the Shabbos before Rosh Hashanah. So in the ethics of the fathers is an interesting Mishnah based on this week's chapter, and it says like this. There are two types of arguments. Machlekes l'shem shamayim, which is an argument for the sake of heaven. It's called a holy argument. Two people argue because they want to have crystallized an idea. They have no malicious intent. It's not a personal argument. It's about the disagreement between two scholars. And the Mishnah says, and then there's a machlekes shalei l'shem shamayim, which means not for the sake of heaven, for selfish interest. And the Mishnah says like this: Kol machlekes l'shem shamayim, every argument that is for a good purpose, for the sake of heaven, meaning it's not for personal gain, but for a better, higher good. Sefer l'Iskayim, such an argument will always endure. And any argument that is for shalei l'shem shamayim, that's not for the sake of heaven, ain't sefer l'Iskayim. It will not endure. And then it continues. Which argument is a so-called holy argument? Machlekes. That's Shammai and Hillel. The classic two sages in the Talmud, Shammai and Hillel, were colleagues, but they disagreed. And not only that, they both built schools, Beis Shammai and Beis Hillel, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel, which are the two classic, throughout the Talmud, they always are disagreeing, except in very few instances. And in most cases, Shammai is more severe, and Hillel more lenient. And you have hundreds of disagreements. They themselves disagree in 3 places, but their students in many more. So that the Mishnah calls is a machlekes l'shem shamayim, because their argument was not for any selfish personal gain. It was to crystallize, to clarify a point, like a legal argument in the Torah, to try to understand the Torah's intentions. And what's a machlekes? What's an argument that's not l'shem shamayim? That's machlekes Korach ve'edasei. That's the argument of Korach and his cohorts, his henchmen, his constituents, his community. And that's the machlekes, the argument in this week's chapter, where Korach challenges Moses in the most severe possible way. And that, the Mishnah says, is an argument that will not endure. So, a few questions about this Mishnah, which are actually questions asked in the classic epic discourse called Ayin Beis, that some of you have been hearing about from me. It's my new obsession. But it's based on a centennial of 100 years ago, in 1912, the Rebbe Rashab, the 5th Chabad Rebbe, a great mystic of the highest order, an unbelievable, brilliant visionary and thinker. In 1912, just as quantum mechanics was rising, just as Einstein was developing his theories, and Freud his, there was another man called Rebbe Rashab, lesser known, but maybe even more radical ideas and pioneering concepts, in the small town of Lubavitch in Belarus, who was developing what's called Ayin Beis. This would become an epic discourse. It's actually a series of over 144 discourses, a flow of over 1,500 pages that he would deliver both in speaking and in writing. And I am actually teaching it every day, every morning. You can see it online on YouTube. I also send out, we created this Club 72, which you can become a free member of, which I send out a weekly summary of the discourse, so you can follow along exactly as it was delivered 100 years ago. It's unbelievable ideas. It's initially seems cryptic, but I'm trying to decipher it, and it's really quite powerful stuff. So in this week's discourse, which is I believe the 6th discourse of this 144 series. So we have a lot more to go. Climbing a mountain. This is the 6th. You have the 3 Shavuos, then you have Nasa Balis, yep, 6th. That's right. So he begins with this opening about this mission I just quoted, about the difference between, and he asks a few questions that stand out. What does it mean that a machlekes should endure? Why would the Mishnah say that an argument would endure? You could say it's an argument that's for good purposes, but what's the emphasis that it would endure? Why is it so important that it should endure? To say that Korach's argument, a negative, bad argument coming from bad intentions, will not endure, that's very clear. Another diuk, so to speak, another emphasis that he points out, and it's pointed out by previous commentaries as well, that when the Mishnah says, which is an argument that is for the sake of heaven, it says the argument between Shammai and Hillel. When it comes to Korach, it doesn't say the argument between Korach and Moses. It just says one side of the argument, Korach. Veidase. Korach doesn't mention the other side. That's question number 2. So in explaining this, and in context of the entire concept of Ayin Beis and its flow, and as I said, this Thursday we'll send out a summary of this in writing of the actual discourse, each chapter. It's 4 chapters. He goes into a whole discussion about what life is all about. And now what I'm going to be saying here is based on this discourse. Obviously need with some adaptation and interpretation. So I'm just qualifying it. For those that may be absolutely versed in the discourse, I don't want you to get the impression I'm repeating it word for word. For those that are not aware of this discourse, I basically can say anything. But I will not, because we're on the record here, and I don't want to be prosecuted at any point that I misinterpreted the Rebbe Rashab's words. Besides from my own integrity, that's not what I try to do. I try to stay true to the message, but nevertheless, to really appreciate it, it does need some introduction and explanation. So he addresses this whole issue of synergy and the whole issue of life and diversity and so on. So let's step back and let's address this in a broader sense of the word. Let's begin with a philosophical question. May I do that? Okay, thanks. The question is the following. Is diversity healthy or unhealthy? That's the question. Now, it may seem obvious to everybody here that diversity is healthy. Diversity is essentially synonymous with individuality. So you can really ask, is individuality healthy or unhealthy? Now, in our day and age, where we call the me generation, or some call it now the I generation, with the iPods and I this and I that, so me, maybe I is even more than me. Our generation, we take for granted individual rights and individuality and our private space and our rights to do as we wish, and this is guaranteed in the United States Constitution, etc., etc., etc. But it has not always been this way, I hope you know, my dear friends, because throughout history, it's actually quite relatively new that individuality is seen as a sacred right. And even today, some say it's gone too far, and look, is it really worth it, and so on. So a little history here. I remember when the millennium struck. This was 12 years ago, the year 2000. So of course all the millennium issues, besides what was it called, the Y2K bug or whatever they thought it was going to destroy the universe or something. Was it that? Y2K? Everyone old enough to remember 12 years ago? Good. Fine. So there was the millennium fever, and I remember the New York Times gave out a special issue. It was called the Me Millennium. It was very interesting. They basically the undercurrent theme of that issue, and I think I saved it even. You probably can find it online. Was the evolution in history in distinguishing between the first millennium and the second, meaning basically from the year 0 to 1000 and then 1000 to 2000. And the key thing that they identified almost in all areas of life, was the me focus. Then the first millennium, historically speaking, the concept of an individual was not seen as a virtue. First of all, people lived in collectives. The idea of having your own space, your own room, your own house was not even an ideal. It was considered to be something that wasn't even a consideration. And not just for financial reasons. And they go through this whole issue. I see some of you making faces. Check it out. I know we take it so for granted. But individuality was not seen as a virtue. Because remember, what ruled the world then were a few individuals. A monarch, a church leader. So there was the comment, when you were born into subjugated and under the authority of some ruler that was not respecting your opinion and not interested in your opinion. And that ruled and governed people's lives. And people didn't even rebel. If there was rebellion, it was because somebody else wanted that monopoly. No one was rebelling from behalf of the people, even though everyone always talks on behalf of the people. Now, mind you, there's some people say it's still that way, but today it's camouflaged in what they call democracy. But we won't go into Noam Chomsky's theories and stuff like that. Regardless, there was definitely a period in time, on many levels, that things were collectives. This was the agricultural society, for example, was based on collective. That people lived around a farm, that they had to. Because the only way for people to survive was to work and collaborate with each other, etc., etc. The idea of individual rights, what we call the Bill of Rights, all men are created equal, and all of us have inalienable divine rights to freedom, pursuit of happiness, and so on. The right of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, freedom of expression, etc., etc., is relatively only a few centuries old. Legislated in an institutionalized way, literally 250, 300 years old. Before that, there was nothing guaranteed like that. And even when you read the Declaration of Independence, which I've read many times, there's an apologetic tone of the Founding Fathers, basically apologizing almost to the world and to King George for having to do this, for declaring independence. They basically say there comes a point where, due to the burdens and the pressures of taxes and stuff like that, that a nation has to make a decision to become autonomous. It's very difficult to cut the umbilical cord. And if you want to talk about individually, let's talk about ourselves psychologically. Do we really cut the umbilical cord from our mothers and our fathers? How independent are we really? How free are we really? Or are we just haunted in some way psychologically by those that have shaped us? So this issue of diversity and individuality is not just a simple issue as it sounds. And then, of course, there's the raging debate from the beginning of time, especially the time in the birth of democracies and freedoms, the big debate, which was how much freedom is healthy and how much is not. Even today, we have in the United States thing called electoral college. Whether it's in effect or not in effect, we have the difference between the House of Representatives and the Congress. Why is it that there are two houses, one of them has equal representatives for each state, two, and another is based on population? Because there was an argument. The states with the smaller populations were not willing to just be represented smaller, so they made two houses. The Electoral College was created because the argument went that the masses are not wise enough to really elect officials, leaders. So they were essentially electing electors that would elect the leaders. However that would work, because the electors technically could choose to elect somebody else. You could have a president win the Electoral College and not the general population. The point is that even today, total trust of individuals is still seen by some as not necessarily correct. So the question of individuality and diversity is a very big one, and it was also what bothered Korach in a way. Korach was not a fool. It says Pikachaya. He was actually very smart. And he was a cousin of Moses, and he was aristocracy. He wasn't a downtrodden. He was wealthy. He was an aristocrat, sophisticated. His challenge seems to be a very appropriate one. He says, Maduat Tisnasu, why? Have you lifted yourself up above all? We were all chosen by God. Basically, he was arguing the power of individuality. Why are some of you more powerful than others? Why don't we just all have power? Mind you that he actually wanted power for himself, but that's another discussion. So this idea of individuality is what Korach addresses long before, in history, this even became a consideration for nations. Because you see, Jews, from the beginning of time, were fierce individuals. It was not born with the United States. They were fierce individuals all the time. When everyone would bow down to Haman, Mordechai, no. When everyone was idol worshippers and pagans, Abraham stood up against his own family and the entire world at the time. Jews were always nonconformists until recently, which is another issue, how they became conformists. But religion was never conformity, it was all about pioneering, about revolution. Moses stood up against Pharaoh, stood up against the trends. So the idea of individuality is built into Torah and Judaism. You know why? Because it's the basis of the entire Torah that begins. Every human being is created in the divine image, as an individual. We're not created like a cluster of grapes. We're each individuals. Each of us emerges in this world alone. And though we have parents and we have influences, but we're individuals, and each with the sanctity of God Himself, in the divine image. Not to be morbid, but in the Torah, even when somebody was hung for a severe crime, it says you cannot let that person hang overnight because it's a divine image. You can't desecrate a human being, even in that context. So for Jews, and the Torah was always sacred individual life and individual rights, because that's the way we were created. And the Mishnah actually in the Talmud, the Sanhedrin, goes on and says about why when you save a life, it's like saving a universe. Saving a life is saving a universe. Because each individual was born like Adam, and an Eve individual, and it's like an entire universe. And killing a person, God forbid, is like killing a universe. Because you're talking about each of us having that power. And that's why it says, Chayev Adam, a person is responsible to say, Bishvili, because of me the entire world was created. Not arrogantly, that it's all there to serve you, but responsibility, that we have the power to change the world. And when things happen, we are individual power. So despite the fact there are 7 billion people on this earth, each person is sacred and has the majesty and the dignity of a divine image within you. Now that alone is a message that's worth hearing every minute of our lives, which we'll soon talk about some more. And Korach was taking the cue. When the Torah was given, just a little while earlier, it says in the Torah, the 10 Commandments. Now there were a few million people standing at Sinai based on the calculations of the time. And when you speak in Hebrew, if you know Hebrew, when you speak to a group, you use different type of language than when you speak to individuals. It's called Lashon Yachid, Lashon Rabim. For example, when you say in English you, when I say you can be you to an individual, and you could also be you to a group. What's a group? A group means I'm speaking to the entire group, you, all of you. Then there is, in Hebrew, on the other hand, when you speak to one person, you say lecha if it's a male, or you say loch if it's a woman, female, feminine, and you say lachem or lachen if it's a group. 10 Commandments, you'd think, then, speaking to a group, God should have been speaking in the plural. Anechi Hashem Elokeichem. I am your God you're as a group. Kabed es avichem, honor your parents. Lesignavu, you shall not steal, as a group. Yet the 10 Commandments are written in the singular as if it was being spoken to one individual. And this can't be an accident. The Hebrew is quite precise. And throughout the Torah you'll find very often it's spoken in the Lashon Yachid, in the first person, to you as an individual. You. As I said, in Hebrew, you, the singular, is one person. So the Medrash answers the question, because when everyone stood at Sinai, they heard the Torah being spoken to them as if no one else was there. It was that personal. Like Rabbi Jonathan Sachs speaks about the Rebbe, who this weekend is 18th yahrzeit, this Shabbos Korach, that the difference between a rabbi and a Rebbe is that a rabbi can speak to 500 people and everyone thinks he's speaking to somebody else. And a Rebbe speaks, he could be speaking to 5,000 people and everyone thinks he's speaking to him. That's the difference when someone is sincere and speaking. It doesn't matter how big a group, every person thinks the message is to me, it's personal. So it's at Mount Sinai, at Sinai, the Jews each heard a personal message, regardless of the fact that someone else right near them also heard it. Like music. You could have 1 million people hearing the same song, everyone hears a personal message, not a collective message. So Korach, taking that cue, challenged Moses. So what is this whole hierarchy going on here? Why is there a hierarchy? Why is there, it doesn't say bureaucracy, but hierarchy of power? Kulam G'dayshim. All of us are holy. All of us are sacred. All of us have the created in the divine image. And you don't find in the chapter an answer to the Korach's argument. Now, this argument, even though philosophically has a point, the problem, of course, is that Korach took it too far. First of all, he wanted power himself, so he wasn't much better. And secondly, he was challenging not some guy. He was challenging Moses, who happened to be chosen by God, and not by Moses himself. As a matter of fact, that Moses would have left up to him, he would never have been the leader. You have a whole chapter in the Torah where Moses argues with God and basically has to be forced to become the leader. He keeps finding all kinds of reasons in Exodus, in the beginning, Shmos, why he doesn't want to be the leader. Everyone knew his humility. Korach also did. So that, of course, was a grave sin. But the argument itself needs to be explained. So this is the issue at hand, the diversity of human beings, the diversity of existence. So in Ayin Beis, as a good so-called spiritual engineering that Ayin Beis is, it goes straight to the root of the issue. Where does diversity begin? If God is one, we say in Shema Hashem Echad, how did diversity get here in the first place? How does one God create such multiplicity, with each of us having such diversity between us? If we're all created in the divine image, we should all be like the divine, which is Hashem Echad, all clones. Or there should just be one of us. So this is a big philosophical question that the Kabbalists are concerned with. And that's why they say that since God wanted to create the universe in a logical way, there has to be some sense to this. You can't just say God can do anything and say, you know what? He created diversity. There has to be a logical structure. And that logical structure is seen by the Kabbalists and elaborated in Ayin Beis as being the vision of an artist that has infinite possibilities and choosing one of those possibilities. So think of an artist that has, or a composer that can compose or create infinite types of art, but then chooses and wants to create one. So that one that he chooses, does that turn it into a finite structure? Or is that just another expression of his infinite capacity? So the Kabbalists, that's how they describe what is called, that some of you may be familiar with, in the few I guess the resident Kabbalists among you, that would be called the spheres. You've heard the 10 spheres. Esser spheres, the 10 spheres. So just to give you a little background why the spheres are such a fundamental aspect in Judaism, is because these are so-called the instruments, the tools, the interfaces, how an infinite divine entity creates diversity. So it's not that the infinite divine, indivisible, unified force splits into parts. It's an infinite force that has the capacity to manifest in infinite possibilities. And hence we have diversity. So diversity is actually a reflection of the so-called artist that can create much art, many different types of art, and chooses to create one. And that structure is called the 10 spheres. That's the DNA of existence. What is the DNA? That everything in existence is made up of 10 personality features. And that's Chachma through Malchus. I can give you a brief overview of those 10. 7 of them are in the Omer book that I've done, which explains them there. But briefly, the 10 go like this. There are 3 intellectual faculties as they manifest in us. So on a conscious level, we either have cognitive skills and we have emotional skills. Those are 2 primary conscious forces. I specifically emphasize conscious because unconscious is a whole other story. So conscious forces, we have the cognitive skill to analyze, to probe, to evaluate, to examine, and so on, to argue. And then we have emotional tools. Emotional tools is what's in it for me. Am I attracted to this? Am I repelled by it? Our emotional reaction. And when you break it down, it breaks into 10. The cognitive break into 3 called Chachma, Bina, Das. So first you conceive of an idea, you develop it, you flesh it out, Bina, and Das is like the aha moment, called Eureka moment, where where it becomes internalized. You feel it, you sense it, you become intimate with the idea. Then come the next 7 faculties. 3 plus 7 equals 10. Am I right? So 7 motions go like this: love, chesed; gvura, severity or judgment, or call it discretion. 3 is tiferes, compassion, empathy, sometimes called beauty. Number 4 is netzach, which is endurance, ambition, drive. The 5th is hod, humility, yielding. The 6th is yesod, which means foundation, literally, or bonding with something. And the 7th emotion is dignity, malchus, sovereignty, dignity, majesty. So these 10 call them 10 archetypes. There's 10 archetypal faculties and features that each of us have in our conscious systems. And furthermore, the Kabbalists explain all of existence is defined by these 10. And you say, 1 second, the world has many more than 10 elements? Because these 10, in the complex configurations, break down into many more. 10 times 10 times 10 times 10. So each of the 10 have the other 9 within them. So 10 times 10 is 100. The 100 have 10, so it's 1,000. So everything in this universe can be traced to the 10 spheres. In its purest form, let's say chesed manifests in water. In its purest form, fire is a manifestation, the reincarnate of gvura. Just to make it even more palatable, so it doesn't sound so esoteric. When you look at something with your physical eyes, you see the outer surface of it. It's called the keli, the container. But every container has an energy within it. So, you see a person, let's say, cry. Tears come out of their eyes. So you know that tears come out of your eyes, that's a sign they must be sad. Or maybe tears of happiness. But some emotion is welling up inside of them. No person will say, first you cry, then you feel sad. First you feel sad within. Sadness is an emotion that is not tangible, cannot be quantified. But if it expresses itself, some reason it creates and fashions tears in our tear ducts, liquid in our tear ducts, and a person cries. You see a smile on someone's face, it tells you that's an outer expression of an inner contentment or satisfaction. So everything in this world is an outer expression of an inner energy. That's called energy and container. So when you see water, you only see water. It's wet, it's bluish white in color, it's refreshing, it falls from it transmits from above down. Fire is the opposite. It's reddish, it's severe, it burns things, it crunches things, water expands, and fire rises. These 2 features are not incidental. It's because chesed is like love, and love flows. Love transmits. Love is gentle. It's refreshing. It's nurturing. Fire comes from gevura. So fire is threatening. It can warm if you channel it, but it's strong. It's aggressive. It evokes in us a red light. Why do you think it's red lights? Because red evokes danger in our minds, fear. It's gvura, it's severity. Fire rises, and so on. So I'm just giving you those examples. If you look at so-called the Kabbalistic map of chemistry and biology, you can trace every item in existence to a configuration of spheres. And understanding these spheres is really understanding the DNA and the inner workings of how we function, how the universe functions. So it's about training ourselves not to look at the symptoms, but look at the roots. Not to look at the container, but look at the energy within. And as I said, these break into 10, which break further into many more. The Kabbalists and the mystics use these 10 as, so to speak, God's paintbrush, God's paint, where God has a plan, and that plan, like an artist wants to create a piece of art, though he can create infinite pieces of art, he chooses to create one, and that one is structured, the structure that we have in existence, and that structure in its earliest evolutionary stage, in its genesis, in its seed, is called the 10 spheres. More precisely, the 10 hidden spheres, from which will emerge the 10 revealed ones. But to bring it back down again to ourselves, it simply means this, that someone with a trained eye, you come to them with a problem, they'll be able to look beneath the surface and say, you described a symptom, I'll tell you where it's coming from. Now, nothing is guaranteed, we can't always see what's going on, but seeing a soul is seeing what's causing us to behave a certain way instead of just looking at the behavior. You see someone is very angry. Anger is fire. Anger is gvura. Why do they have so much gvura inside of them? Is it by birth? Is it due to life experiences? Is it due because they saw anger in their early formative years? So there are many forces within us that are not visible, even to ourselves, that shape us. So really, looking at the energy helps you understand what's going on the container level. We live on the container level, on the outer container level. And without trained eye, without discipline, it's very difficult to often see what's going on beneath the surface. So understanding these energies is really the key to understanding life, understanding yourself. So let's say you were born with a pure form of chesed, coming straight from the source of the artist's vision of what your love should be like. Where did it get screwed up? Where did it get distorted? If you look at a child, a newborn child, it's like freshly fallen snow. It's not been trampled upon yet. It's not been shaped. But then our parents are our first influences, and nobody is perfect. So even healthy parents are going to impact us one way or another. So what happens is the chesed in your soul now is being shaped by people who don't necessarily have a perfect form of chesed or love. And that's where we learn how to love. Now if it's a really abusive or dysfunctional parent, a child of a family, not only is it distorted, it gets very, very messed up. So suddenly this pure love, the archetype which was so perfect, is now grown like, think of a tree that's been what's the word for it? That's been blocked from growing, so it grows crooked. So chesed now, the chesed that you have in your life, the way you love, and the way you are loved, is not a product necessarily of the quintessential you. It's a product of so many forces in life, starting from your childhood, then through our adolescence, through educational, through peer pressure, through social pressure. So at this point where we are today is a far cry from where you began. So how do you retrace the steps from where you are to where it is? That's why studying Ayin Beis, for instance, studying Hasidic thought, teaches you how it is on the purer level, and helping us then realign ourselves. It's like think of any machine. Once it gets disaligned, you may think that disalignment is healthy. So you need someone who understands how it's a healthy process to then realign where you are to where you could be. Or another way of putting it is actualizing your true potential, which may be trapped, which is usually trapped inside of you. And you may have it there, but you may not even have the tools how to access it. Like water that's running deep under the ground. You have to dig the well and then use containers to draw the water from its deepest source. The same thing with our lives. I'm just pointing out how relevant this is and critical in understanding it. And there's a real process. You can actually be trained to see yourself in a new way. Instead of seeing that person in the mirror, or seeing what you think you are, and what you project to others and so on, what really makes you tick? And why is your outer projection so different than your inner self? And how can you do something to realign it to some extent, to make it more consistent? This, in simple words, is the reason, the importance of studying the spheres, and studying their meaning, and studying how they manifest in the energy level and the container level. So though it may sound a little esoteric, it actually, once you decipher it, it's profoundly relevant and profoundly meaningful to our personal lives in every possible way. Now I can use examples, and many, many examples, but name a problem and you'll be able to dissect and identify how that problem, no problem begins on its own. Just like a person that you comfortable? You look like, you got right into, you want another pillow? Yeah? Okay. This class is not about comfort zones, remember that. So you name a problem, every problem has a root. Like when a person gets lost, you don't just suddenly get lost. There's a point where you veered off went off course. And at that point, it was a little wrong turn. But the problem is you kept on moving. And the faster you moved, the faster you got lost. So sometimes moving fast doesn't always work well. You have to know when to hold them and when to fold them. Let's put it that way. So the bottom line is that as you travel and you make a little move, at that point you may not even know you made the wrong move. Or you may minimize it and say, big thing, so what? But then at some point, you find yourself lost in the woods. And you have no way of getting back. Understanding these ideas in Hasidic thought help you realign. First of all, helps you see, resonates. Someone says something to you. What really is what a good mentor is all about? a good teacher, a good friend, they say something to you that resonates. You say, wow, that's something that I always knew. I didn't quite put it that way. It resonates, meaning it touches something inside of you that you were not fully aware of. Now you're more aware. Now the question is, why weren't you aware of it on your own? And even if you become aware, how do you make that awareness a concrete reality? How do you take that truth and now turn it into a working model? That's not as easy because we have habits, we have routines, we have comfort zones, we have fears, we have, you name it. So the challenge really is understanding the concept of the spheres is really understanding ourselves in our purest form, the archetype. And then tracing our steps back to there. So take it back to Korach and this whole discussion of diversity and individuality. Individuality is no question, as I said, it's a divine gift. We're each created in the divine image with unique skills, with unique personality. Ein deis vein shovos, we don't have similar faces, we don't have similar way of thinking, and that's intentional because each of us has a unique contribution to make that no one else can make. But individuality can also go rampant, run wild. If you have no direction with your individuality, you can suddenly become a very selfish individual and say, listen, I'm unique, and I don't really care about anyone else. And as a matter of fact, I see everyone else here to serve me. So individuality can lead straight to anarchy as well. So the challenge is, how do you balance the two? Here, Korach was arguing well about individuality, but it led to anarchy. Because it was not coming from a humble place. Because individuality minus humility does not bring great things. Arrogance minus individuality doesn't bring great things either. It's arrogance plus humility is the formula that works. Take away one of the two, and you're going to have big problems. And as a matter of fact, the more individual the person is, the more humility is necessary, because you can become suddenly self-consumed with yourself. So here's where Machlekes comes in, the difference between Shammai and Hillel and Korach, as I shall soon elaborate. But I want to still talk a little more about the spheres, how the Rebbe Rashab explains diversity at its root. So diversity is at its root is a vision in an artist, in a cosmic artist called God. If you don't like the word God, use whatever word you like. It doesn't matter to me. It's all language. I say that because, as I've shared many times the story here, when I began teaching this class, who knows when, in the previous millennium, that sounds ancient, just 12 years ago. So when I started teaching the class, so many years ago, I remember that so the core group were people for, let's put it this way, they weren't exactly reverent, especially to rabbis and religion. People from the arts and entertainment industry that found their own religion called music. And I remember being faced with a dilemma, because they were coming week after week. It was like this informal class. We're talking about the early 80s. This is pre-everything, basically. Prehistoric. We were cavemen then. There was no email. There were no fax machines. There were telephones. And there were typewriters, just for the record. And we communicated pretty well then, too. The welfare of the human condition, I don't think, got much better. Let's put it this way. As they say, junk in, junk out. So computers don't change anything. Depends what you put in. Like I said, if you're an accelerated life and your life is below par, it's going to be accelerated mediocrity, basically. If it's a quality life, so then it's a quality life whether it's accelerated or not. So recognizing that the people coming to the class, the discussion were, who knows how they were stereotyping me. And I always, I've come to learn that stereotypes is 90% of the work is getting rid of the stereotypes. Not really educating people, but uneducating them of bad stereotypes. So I tried an experiment. I realized that even before I opened my mouth, I am hardly projecting a neutral image. It's got this beard, and there's a yarmulke, and whatever that conjures up in people's minds. Some angry grandfather that schlepped him to Yom Kippur to synagogue against his will, an irrelevant Hebrew school teacher, or a scene in a Woody Allen movie, whatever it may be. You know that scene where he suddenly turns into a chassid when that anti-Semitic, So I tried an experiment. I decided I'm not going to use any language that loaded. that can be used against me. So I created this whole new vocabulary. I've told this story several times. It's a great lesson in communication. And instead of using God, I use the word the essence, or higher reality. Or if it was a particular New Age group, I used like non-existential states of undefined energy. Okay? Fine. Then there was, instead of Torah, blueprint, instead of mitzvahs, connections, instead of Mashiach and Geula, destination. So here I was pontificating and waxing eloquent about connection to the essence of reality, to your own inner essence, the journey, following a roadmap, a blueprint, connections, and finally reaching the ultimate destination where there's a full alignment between the inner undefined energies and the outer expression of them. So, I mean, I remember everybody was like, they loved it. It was great. They were eating it up. It was so good. What can I tell you? I felt bad that one day I'm going to have to spill the beans. So I'm going on. There was even, I remember there was an artist there. She was an artist, and she says, you're describing the essence of art in the most beautiful way. It's all about expressing the undefined into the defined. And everyone had their way of appreciating it. Then came the big day. A few weeks passed, a guy comes over to me and says to me, are you talking about God? Little did he know, it wasn't just God, it was Torah, Mashiach, mitzvahs, it was everything. Chickens on your head, seders, the whole works. I was trying to get them indoctrinated into the cult. This was a way to do it. I was breaking down their defenses. Anyway, so he says, are you speaking about God? So I said, yes I am, but shh, don't tell it to the others. Don't spoil it for them. So the experiment worked. So that's why I said, use the word God. I don't care what words you use. Going back to the thing is like this. The root of diversity, as defined in Ayin Beis, based on discourses before, is an image, a defined image in an infinite and beyond infinite artist, whatever name you want to call it, the undefined energies of the essence, the higher reality, that has infinite possibilities in creating art or music, and chose one. That vision is called the 10 hidden spheres, from which become the 10 revealed spheres, the DNA of existence. Scientists can only take you that far. And metaphysics goes all the way to the source and the root, into the mind of God, and even beyond the mind. So without going into a long esoteric discussion of how infinite gets packaged into the finite, suffice it to say, using ourselves as an example, that you can have infinite possibilities as an artist, as a writer, as whatever you are. How many ideas are you able to conceive of? There's no answer to that. It's really an infinite amount. The only problem is we have limited time. And at the end of the day, we are mortals. But hypothetically, conceptually, you can conceive of ideas on and on and on. But yet, to create something in this world, you need one idea. You can't have a million ideas. That one idea then has to be fleshed out and has to be then executed and implemented into concrete, tangible terms. So when you see a piece of art on the wall, you know there's an artist that put it, but that artist could have made 1,000 other pieces of art. But this piece of art captures a certain component of that artist's personality. So existence and diversity of existence is essentially God's envisioning you and I. So what do you look like in the image? What does your image look like in the artist's mind? What piece of art are you in your purest form before you've been shaped by other human beings or by your own distorted vision of yourself? In other words, who are you really and who are you in actuality? And can you realign these two? This, in essence, is the whole discussion. So diversity per se is absolutely divine. But it's only divine when you have the humility to align it to its purpose. For example, the human body. The human body is a perfect example of synergy. Would you call yourself a composite of parts or one unit? One unit. One unit made up of many, many parts, but you're more than the sum of the parts. If a Martian, someone who never saw a human being, saw a human body dissected, no way they would ever imagine that our nervous systems, our circulatory systems, our minds, our hearts, our livers, the whole diversity. I'm not going to go through all the 75 trillion cells. Okay? And now I just read 100 trillion microbes inside each human being. That's big numbers, 100 trillion. It's even bigger than the U.S. debt. That's how big it is. You know? So these numbers are, what is that thing in Manhattan? That you see the debt going up like every day and our part in it? What is that? On 6th Avenue somewhere, right? Then there's another one by Union Square. What's that? I can't figure out what those numbers are. Do you ever figure that one out? It's just art? Just numbers going random? No. There's nothing random in this universe. I can't believe that. Now, the beginning is a clock, but then when you get to the details, it's like weird. It works, I don't know. Anyway, it doesn't matter. Just, I'm a New Yorker. I'm observing New York phenomena. Trivia. So all these trillions, no one would ever imagine they all come together. And here you have a healthy human body. And I say healthy because obviously, God forbid, one mutant cell can wreak havoc. A healthy body with literally millions and millions of parts. Who's the captain of the ship? Who's telling your eye to create hand-eye coordination? Simple thing like that. You know, scientists till today don't really understand how it works. They just know it works. They have all kinds of theories. Let alone all the other coordination. You know, God forbid you go to a hospital and suddenly see a part not working, and you realize it's a miracle. What did we establish? That a person breathes 17 breaths every minute. A healthy breathing pattern of a child, which adds up, I think, to 23,000 a day or something like that. Who even notices? Would you know that you breathed 23,000 times today? But then look at someone struggling to breathe, and you suddenly realize, hey, you know, this is a pretty big miracle. How many components have to be working right for air, oxygen to go in through your nose and mouth, go to your lungs, do what it has to do, then be exhaled? You know, think about it, the odds. And that's just one system. So there's a synergy, there's a ultimate harmony within diversity, absolute diversity. There's not two parts of the body that are extra, that are the similar. They say even every hair follicle is different. No two fingerprints that are the same. And yet they all work together in this fascinating harmony. There you have classic example of diversity plus humility creates beauty. Should the body at any time turn on itself, as we know when there's, let's say, an organ transplant, the biggest issue is immunity system. The immunity system will reject a foreign element. There are illnesses that the body turns against itself. Should one organ turn against the other, what would happen? It would have unbelievable. Or let's say a conference of liberal organs would all get together and say, you know what? It's time for us to, long enough I've been a liver, I'd like to experience being a heart for a week. And the heart says I want to be the brain, and the brain says I like to be the what else is there? I can't even remember. The lungs. Okay? The list goes on. And they have this organ convention, and all the organs, everybody, we're going to now experience diversity. Which means each of us is going to serve the role of another. What would happen? Destruction. The windpipe, the food pipe, are two pipes that have to work in particular, perfectly coordinated fashion. Now when food gets in your mouth, the windpipe knows to shut itself down, and it should go down the other pipe. And when air goes into your lungs, into your mouth, the other way around. So many other examples that can go on and on. You know, you look at these nature shows. Today we see cameras in places that are unbelievable to see the diversity, and each system has its own particular beauty. This is diversity, but not like Korach's type. This is diversity that's part of how the image of the artist, the vision of the artist wanted it to be this way. So the vision of the artist is what keeps it all together. So let's say, take the example of musical notes. The composer wrote those notes. So play them in the right way, and you have beautiful music. But let's say, for argument's sake, the musical notes suddenly had a life of their own. Maybe you can make a play based on this. And they suddenly jump over the page and say, you know what, we're going to party. I'm not interested in being part of this. I've been hanging around with you guys too long. You know, I've been a long enough. I want to go out of the box. I want to go party. What are you going to have? No more. You're no longer going to have music. You're just going to have noise, if anything. Now, of course, this is hypothetical because it's the artist or the composer that keeps those musical notes together, and the ones that play it right. Like, what do they say? What's worse than hearing one person out of tune sing? Two people out of tune, Try it out, you'll see. It can get very grating. I've been a victim of this situation more than once. So, what you have is, the same diversity suddenly becomes chaos, and worse than chaos. Because if you only had one note, how much trouble could it make? But if you have millions of them, and they're so diverse, and they're suddenly now not talking to each other, you've had yourself war. Which really describes the human condition. We have cultures, races, nations, communities, individuals who are at war with each other. Why? We're all made of the same flesh and blood. We all have similar interests. We all want love. We all have children we want to protect. We all think that we have something to contribute. But because diversity has gone crazy without the humility necessary that keeps the balance. If we all can go back to God's mind and say, what did you want of us? Each of us would say, okay, I belong in the big picture of the 7 billion of us are all cells of one larger organism, indispensable. As an individual, that doesn't make you conformist. As an individual, you remain your individual you, but you're part of a bigger picture. Korach only took half that story. He focused on individuality and forgot about the coordination. Because he did not appreciate humility. Moses was the classic example of leader, individual plus humility. The humblest man that walked on earth. And you see it in this chapter, in an unbelievable way. They're talking about, what would you do? God chose you to be the leader. He sends you to take the Jews out of Egypt, gives you the Torah, you lead the people through the wilderness, and then suddenly a few chutzpah guys come and say, who gave you leadership? Who are you? So even if you are a very fine person, you say, well, don't go to me, go to God. What do you want from me? Moses falls on his face and sees it as his failure. As a leader, he sees it as his failure. Something's wrong here. Because he was a shepherd. And a shepherd does not think about blaming himself, blaming the sheep, he blames himself. God tests his leaders with sheep, the Medrash says. When Moses became a leader, the first time Moses is described in the Torah, it says, Moshe Hayaraya. Moses was a shepherd. And just in case you think that's a random, David Hayaraya comes to King David. Also David was a shepherd. So the Medrash says, because God tests his leaders with sheep. He was a shepherd. Moses, the Medrash says, was tending to the flock of his future father-in-law Yisrael, thousands of sheep. And suddenly he notices one sheep is missing. There you go. That alone, even that he noticed it. Who would notice one sheep out of thousands? And he starts searching for the sheep. Till he finds it a distance away, drinking water from a spring. And Moses carries the sheep back on his shoulders. And God said, if a man can treat one single sheep that way, and no one's watching, I will trust him with my people. Because that's a leader. And it goes even further. He could have said, what's the sheep doing by the water? We already all drank. He didn't look at it that way. He saw a sheep, must have been thirsty. He sees Korach and all of his henchmen mutineering. What's bothering them? He doesn't think in terms of that there's something wrong with them. What's bothering them? And he begins to talk to them. And he says he talks softly, and he pushes it off for a night. Maybe they'll rethink their position. And when he summons these two of the most wicked people of his time, Dasan and Aviram, from the beginning of time, they've always made trouble. I think it's Edward G. Robinson in the Ten Commandments. They're troublemakers from the beginning. They informed our Moses back in Egypt. He summons them. He's the leader. They should be coming out of respect. They don't come. So you could think Moses is going to ignore them. No, he goes to them. He goes to them, and in sensitivity. This is a leader. And even at the end, he says, you know what? We'll make a test, and we'll see whose offerings God accepts. If he accepts yours, I was wrong. What do you mean you were wrong? God chose you. Don't you know that you just received the Torah? That's a true leader. You're not going to find leaders today like that. Because this is a leader who never wanted to be the leader. So he was a true leader. That sensitivity is humility. And Korach projected his own arrogance on Moses. He thought, well, if I was a leader, I'd feel pretty proud. And therefore he said, Why are you leaders? He misunderstood, and Korach made that big mistake. So as explained in the root of things, the diversity of human beings is sacred. It's the 10 spheres of God's envisioning. It's the artist envisioning a beautiful painting. But in this case, he did give the musical notes free will. That's us. We can participate in the song, in the music, in the symphony, or we can choose not to. That's our call. And then, when we choose to, then our diversity becomes a great asset, because then each of us is doing our indispensable contribution. When we're not, we're off on our own agendas, so we're not fulfilling, first of all, our mission, and we're also not finding our own inner happiness. What is the option if a person feels like an individual but's lacking humility? I'm not suggesting they should stop being an individual, but they're not necessarily going to go on a very constructive path. The other extreme that some people argue, which is equally abhorrent and disturbing, is the demand for conformity. Whether it's religious conformity or other forms of conformity, basically saying when people get left on their own, they're going to get into trouble. It's the control, mind control, peer pressure, whatever other pressure you could apply. That's equally problematic, because there you're tampering with God's plan. The artist wants diversity, doesn't want a clone. So yes, the argument is, diversity can lead to anarchy, which leads to war. But that's what God wants, diversity. The challenge is, how do you maintain diversity and have the humility to create a painting, to create harmony? That's the challenge. So the response of absolute individuality at the expense of everyone else, or the response of absolute conformity because of the fear of what individuality can bring, are both non-options. That's why the Torah documents the Korach story. Why do we have to be told this whole story in the first place? He was wrong, and that's it. We have to be told every time somebody mutineered, because his question was a good question. He argued, why did you take the power? Because he was basically pointing out that sometimes a person can take power out of arrogance. Korach himself, he was an example of that. And diversity is healthy. The lesson, however, is diversity has to come with humility. When it's done on the spirit of God's, the vision of God, then you have yourself beauty. And that is ultimately how the Ayin Bey's discourse explains the whole idea of diversity, the 10 spheres, as they're aligned with their source. As opposed to either no diversity at all, or the other extreme of diversity without direction. So the challenge is, how do you create that harmony within diversity? So now we go back to the Mishnah, the two models of argument. One is a machlekes l'shem shamayim, and one is machlekes shalei l'shem shamayim. The Mishnah is saying that there's two types of results from diversity. One can lead to war and chaos, and the other leads to what's called hiskalalus, interconnectivity and symbiosis, harmony. And Shammai and Hillel is the model of the latter, and Korach and his henchmen is the model of the former. So let's start with the healthier one. Shammai and Hillel. It's healthy to be diverse. Shammai is gevura, Hillel is chesed. Hillel is lenient, Shammai is more severe. Which is the correct approach? There's no answer to that. It depends which perspective you're looking at things. Each of them has something to say that's important to know. Each of them it's all about context. So that's why the Mishnah says, Machlekes l'shem shamayim seifel iskayim. Why is the Mishnah saying that it will endure? Because it has to endure. It's not just optional. We need to have diversity. We need to know that we are different colors and different personalities and different opinions. But it's all because God, the artist, wants it that way, not because we're such arrogant, individualistic creatures. So that model is, and there's two, Shammai and Hillel. When it comes to the second model is the chaotic one, where only Korach is mentioned. Because Moses didn't argue. Moses was not a party to that type of argument. An argument that is for the sake of heaven, yes, it's two colors, red and blue, which is more beautiful. They both have their virtues, and you need both of them, and they need to mix together. Which is more beautiful, your eyes or your nose? I'm not talking now about subjective. I mean to say both are necessary. What creates beauty? It's not one feature. It's the perfect symmetry of many features. So when it comes, however, to a war of Korach, there's no interconnectivity. This is one person wanting power and challenging. And this one will not endure. It can't endure. You know why it can't endure? Because it's built into it that it's going to destroy. Because it's not interested in working with others. It's interested in dominance. That type of individuality cannot work because it's lacking humility, and it has to lead. It's on a destructive path. On a subtle level, the 24,000 students of Rabbi Akiva that died during the counting of the Omer were an example. Great sages, but they burned each other up. They couldn't tolerate and coexist with each other. You have many other examples of so-called wars, sometimes intellectual wars, emotional ones, and then we have real war, where human beings can turn on each other as a result of the arrogance. So individuality is a double-edged sword in that sense. Align it with the higher spheres and with a higher vision of the artist, and you have beauty. Allow it to go off on its own course, and you have mutiny and anarchy. And that's the two models that he discusses in Ayin Beis. And one endures, as I said, and one cannot endure. So in our own lives, applying this to our own lives, each of us has unique skills. Everybody in this room, everybody online, and everybody else. Everyone's got their unique personality. Even within your personality, you have different unique elements, different days of the week, different stages in your life. Each moment, each stage, each individual has something unique to contribute. It's a rule, cardinal rule in Jewish thought and Torah thought, that every piece is exactly necessary, not one extra, not one missing. The human, just like the body that way, same thing in nature. So when the great connoisseur of music, the Archduke of Austria, met Mozart for the first time, and he thought he was this great appreciator of music, says to Mozart, beautiful music, but far too many notes. Can you imagine? Far too many notes. So Mozart purportedly responded, yes, Your Majesty, but not one more than necessary. Okay. So you have a beautiful building that was planned and thought through for years and years, and then one of us is a wise guy, we come to the building and say, you know what, I don't like that room, move this, move that, move that. Then the architect suddenly shows up. And you have no clue why he wanted that room. And you may move one room and the whole building falls apart. So there's a bigger plan to our lives. Each part of our lives is a piece of life. The example he uses in Ayin Beis for this is actually letters and a word. It's a perfect example of synergy. You look at letters, the letters don't tell you much. You teach a child Aleph Beis, ABC. So they learn A, B, C, D, E. One day they will learn that you can combine letters. Take the letter H, E, A, and T, you have heat. C-O-L-D, of cold. L-O-V-E, of love. L alone, the O alone, the V alone, the E alone, you have no idea, especially as a beginner student. So what is the difference between the letters and the word? The difference is the word is diversity, harmony within diversity. The letters is just the diversity. But on the other hand, you can't have the harmony without the diversity. There's no way that you can create a word without letters. The same thing is in our lives. Each of our lives is like a book, or maybe volumes, or more specifically words made up of letters. But we focus on, and we read, we only see the letters because we live in the moment. We're distracted and overwhelmed by the minutiae and the details of our lives. So you see the letter, this letter, that letter. Once in a while, a few letters come together and make a little sense. But how many of us can read our own story? How many of us know our own story? A story, mind you, that's still unfolding. It's a narrative. Appreciating the artist's view of your life can help you look and connect the dots, the coordinates, and start saying, well, you know, what are all these letters about? Why is it that I was blessed with these opportunities? Why is it that I have a particular way of looking at things? Why is it that I have this personality, different than another person's? These are all letters. And they all are there to make up new words, that make up phrases that turn into chapters and into books and so on. Aligning yourself to your own inner 10 spheres, to your own inner structure, helps you appreciate not just the pieces, but how they're part of a bigger puzzle. And that's the example he uses. He actually uses the word Baruch. Baruch means blessing. It's made up of Beis, Reish, Vav, Chaf. So when you teach a student, you teach a Beis, it's one letter. But one day those letters are going to come together and it means a word. So when you and I hear the word, we also say Beis, Reish. We also say Beis. But when you say Beis, your Beis means it's part of the Beis of an entire word, which is blessing. With all the deep meanings in what blessings are, and the books and essays and materials written about it, literature on the topic. All the same letter that a student who doesn't even yet know the meaning says also Beis, Reish, Vav, Chaf. So there's a synergy, as he explains, there's not just the synergy of the letters coming together, there's also the particular synergy of why you're expressing it this way and not another way. This is an example of the energy of our life as opposed to our containers. So the bottom line is we all live on the container level. Here you have your job, your responsibilities, what am I going to do tomorrow, I'm traveling, I'm doing this, I'm doing that. It's a jumble of letters and fragments all over the place. And you have two ways to go. Either the fragmentation will only intensify, or you're going to start finding some common denominators that will connect the letters to words, and the words into story. And that's the story of your life. Actually, the word Sfirat, comes from the meaning to count, that's numbers. It also means to relate, a sipur, to tell a story. And it also means sapphire, to illuminate, like the sapphire stone, which is discussed later in Ayin Beis. So in other words, you can look at your life as just a bunch of mediocre or boring details. Numbers. It's a numbers game. Or you can see that numbers as being part of the sipur, a story. Or even more, the story is also illuminating. Now, a person who's trained this way looks at human beings, they're always looking at how this person is part of the beauty of the world. That you have something unique to contribute. Do you have any friends like that look at you that way? Or they look at you of like what you can do for them today. Or even if they like you, it's all at the moment. You're part of, you have a unique and indispensable contribution that's part of the whole big picture. People who see the picture appreciate that. That's how you begin to realize that someone is indispensable by looking at their soul. What is their bigger picture? So we may not see our entire narrative because as it unfolds, we're too close. We're too close to the trees to see the forest. We're too close to the letters to see the words. Too close to the words to see the chapters, the volume, the story. But it's still unfolding, and you still can spend time, maybe once a week, Shabbos, maybe in the morning, to step back and say, what are the letters of my life are like, and what story are they telling? Or they're just chaotic and they're not telling any story. It's like a bunch of musical notes all going in 1,000 different directions. Just even thinking about it already begins to change things if you just apply yourself. Because remember, without applying yourself, you can convince yourself everything is just all organized. It's all figured out. I know people who are so organized, but they have no idea where they're going with their lives. They have it all documented, and they have their schedules and their calendars and their perfect, contact management and all that. They're connected and plugged in every gadget possible. But he asked them, so what's your soul's mission? I didn't think about that yet, Or I don't even know if I have a soul. It's even better. So the point is that, there are people who have millions of frequent flyer miles, but have never moved an inch, soulfully speaking. And then there are people who move very far and they never travel physically. So it's more about the qualitative movement. And in that sense, therefore, each of our lives is made up of diversity, made up of details. The details can either become fragments, like in the Korach scenario, and that cannot endure, because ultimately that's going to crash. At some point, the fragments of your life are going to catch up with you, and you're going to start being very anxious because it's weighed down by just too many things, and without any so-called direction. It's called the middle-age blues. And middle age has become very young. I know teenagers that say they're middle-age blues. I guess it's middle age between when you're 15, between 15 and 30, you're middle age. And it's all relativity theory. So we have that, or you have the opposite direction, with the diversity of our lives, not by eliminating it, all becomes part of a bigger picture, which of course is predicated on the fact that we need to have a mission. And we say in the morning, Moda'ani, you're looking at the hub that connects all the spokes. So hopefully some of the things I shared here can have planted some seeds, and maybe a new way to look at yourself and your life. What are the letters? What are the words? You may be surprised to find out when you start analyzing it, dissecting it. You may find out the things you think is a story are just a bunch of letters, and the things that you think are letters are maybe a big part of your story. So that alone, to distinguish, to define what is a priority, what is secondary, what is the plot, who are the main characters, who are the secondary characters. It's a good way to look at your life. People are addicted to different shows and movies and performances, but maybe it would be interesting to get addicted to your own performance and look at yourself and say, what story are you telling? So we all know that it's easy, that the big part of the attraction of television and so on is to live vicariously through other characters. It takes the burden off yourself. You can say, I get excited about someone else's life. I know people who are soap opera addicts, can't miss an episode, and they're more excited about it than their own lives, which is the saddest part. So you ask them, so what's going on with your life? Anything new in your personal life? And they start telling you, this character in a soap opera was about to get married. They're more excited about it. So I said, and you? Well, I have no time to think about me. I have a whole show to deal with here. And though I'm not, per se, fire and brimstone against entertainment or against sports, but when it replaces your life, there's some trouble. There's something wrong. If it replaces your life, you got yourself a problem. And it's easy to do that today because all you got to do is go on the internet. You really can't get bored on the internet because there's infinite channels. That's a good taste of infinity right there. But what about you? What about your story? So, looking in time base, looking into ourselves, you are an indispensable piece of beautiful art, envisioned by the greatest artist of all. You know who I'm talking about, right? So I'm not using the name because I don't want to turn anyone off of it. And they created a universe and created us with such eloquence and poetry. And the question is, are we playing out our verse? Are we playing our music? Are we even aware that we have that type of music within us? So I know we all get glimpses of it, and at times, maybe sometimes more than a glimpse. But this is your heritage. This is your 24/7 destiny. And the question is, how much time do you even give to it? Or we get caught up with all the other distractions and say, let me first deal with that. By the time you finish dealing with it, you can be a nice 120 years old, very healthy and well, and missed all those opportunities. So I don't mean to say this in a negative way. I'm talking about in a positive way. So my friends, what I'd love to see in myself and yourself is that we all live up to the art and the music that we were meant to live up. And the beautiful thing here is also, it's not predestined. This is your music, just play it. You're part of creating the music. So it's more than just a musical note to play, you also have instruments. So you also contribute in how that music is going to sound and how it will play. It's not just whether you're playing out God's plan. You're also a partner in it. That makes it only more exciting and also, of course, more risky. But God is the ultimate gambler, and He took a risk with us and said, look, I'll lay it all on the table. I'll give them the free will. As Isaac Bashever Singer says, we must believe in free will. We have no choice. So there we go. He's given us the will to play our music or not to play it. And to play it perhaps in ways that even God didn't completely envision. But the vision is there, and the structure is there, and it's all rooted in that deeper place. And that's what Korach taught us, diversity, but he was missing the humility. Humility is recognizing that diversity is a gift. It makes you more responsible, not makes you more powerful. Like God tells Moses, I gave you strength and leadership, not for you, I gave it to you for them. God gives us uniqueness in order to serve uniquely, not to take uniquely. And it's interesting, taking, we all can be very similar in how we take, but how we give is very unique to us. Taking looks very similar. You stand on the receiving line, you just take. I know some of us have devised sophisticated, unique ways to take. But at the end of the day, giving is where you see the true contribution of an individual. So God bless everybody with the power of Shammai and Hillel, the power to appreciate your diversity, your individuality, appreciate diversity around us, learn how how collaboration, interconnectivity really ultimately works. And of course, humility thrown into the formula is really what makes it go around. And living up to what you're really capable of being. That you, like the blessing given to in the Talmud, there's the story with the tree. He said with the person who the tree protected. He says the tree looked at the tree. He says, you don't need a blessing to grow. You don't need a blessing to have fruit. You don't need a blessing to have shade. So I give you a blessing that the fruit that you produce should be like you, which is a real blessing, meaning that you can replicate yourself. Not as a clone, but to create not just you being unique, but what you create and bring into this world also is unique and gives the power to create more uniqueness. The greatest blessing you can see as a parent or as a teacher is not to have a student or a child that looks like you. You want a student or a child that takes what you've given and does new things, completely new things that you never would have conceived of. Then you know that it has real power. That's real life. It's not about confirming you and just replicating yourself. It's about creating something that is so dynamic that it can go in so many, it has confidence to go in new directions. It says that the child's power is more powerful than the parent's power. And that too comes from the parent. Now some of us are actual parents, some of us are teachers that are also parents to our students. And God bless everyone, those that need to have children should have children in the right time. And above all, that not to get distracted and keep your sights on the prize, on the goal. And make sure you know what are the means and what is the end. What is the bigger objective? What is the primary objective, as opposed to the secondary means to get there? And I said this week's chapter is a good opportunity to realign ourselves to that and reconnect. As I said, if you get the Ayin Bay's material, it'll only amplify the ideas I shared here this evening. And as I said, I hope I planted some seeds, but like all fruit, there should bear more fruit within you and within others. And we should all celebrate together and share many good occasions. A lot of what I've also said here this evening is, of course, taken from my great teacher, the Rebbe, who was a student of his teacher, who was a son of the Rebbe Rashab, who wrote Ayin Beis. So there's also that personal connection. This weekend, as I said, the 18th yahrzeit of 3rd of Tammuz, 18 years ago, that my teacher physically is not here, but lives on in me and hopefully my teachings and all that I do. So obviously this class is a direct tribute to him, and as he would say, it was a direct tribute to those that came before him. But as I said, we're all links in a chain, and hopefully it's a great tribute to everyone that you bring the teachings to in your unique way. So it's like a perpetual motion, a perpetual effect. A pool in Imshechus is called, where like a flame lights another flame and another flame lights another flame ad infinitum. And the initial flame does not get diminished. It's the only thing in this world that you light another flame, the first flame does not get weaker, it gets stronger actually, because there's more flames. And when they come together, they have more power. So think of it that way. Every person you meet, every interaction you have is an opportunity to ignite another flame. A flame that, mind you, is inside every one of us, because we all have Ner Hashem Nishmas Adam. The flame is alive within us, but it has to be sometimes fanned, or like a pilot flame, it has to be amplified. It has to be turned into a full-blown flame that actually illuminates and warms one another. So it's an honor to communicate with fellow flames and musical notes and verses, and hopefully together we can write many interesting books, literally and figuratively, and that's it for the show tonight. But I will announce that Philip will be giving his class tomorrow evening. I always have a problem ending. I don't know how to end. I need some ideas how to just like wind down. Philip will be giving his class tomorrow evening, right? 7:00. Anyone who's interested, please let us know. And I will be here next Wednesday, or we shall decide. We may have to make an announcement of a location change. We'll let you know. So please leave us your email addresses so we can stay in touch. And any way that I can help you in your journey, please don't hesitate to call on me or Velvel. And if any questions or suggestions, and thank you very much.